In a quiet village by the edge of a dark forest, people often told strange stories. They said that at night, the trees would whisper secrets, and sometimes shadows moved between the branches. No one ever went into the forest after dark because they were too afraid. But four brave friends, eager to know the truth, decided to explore the forest one evening. They packed their bags and headed out, determined to discover what was causing the strange stories. As the sun set, the forest grew darker, and the air turned chilly. The trees seemed to loom over them, and the wind began to howl. Every step they took seemed to echo in the silent woods. They heard distant rustling sounds, but no one could see what was making them. Despite the growing fear, they pressed on, hoping they would find the source of the whispers. The deeper they walked into the forest, the more uneasy they felt. The whispering sounds grew louder, almost as if the trees were talking to each other. "Did you hear that?" one of the friends asked, but no one could answer. The whispers seemed to be coming from everywhere, but when they looked around, there was no one in sight. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the trees, and one of them swore they saw a shadow move quickly across their path. They stopped, frozen with fear. The darkness around them seemed to press in tighter, and their hearts raced. One of the friends wanted to turn back, but the others urged him to keep going. "We're close," they said, not fully believing it themselves. The whispers continued to echo, but they couldn't understand the words. The trees seemed alive, and the air grew thick with mystery.
After what felt like hours of walking, the group finally reached a clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood an old, twisted tree. It looked different from the others, its bark dark and rough, and the air around it felt heavy. As they approached, a strange figure appeared in the shadows. It was tall and thin, with a long cloak that seemed to blend into the night. The figure didn't speak, but the whispers grew louder, surrounding the friends. Fear washed over them as they realized the figure wasn't moving. It stood, perfectly still, almost like it was watching them. The friends stood there, unsure of what to do. The figure slowly raised its hand, pointing toward the tree. They followed the gesture, but nothing seemed unusual about the tree. The whispers were now so loud they could barely hear each other speak. The forest felt alive with an energy they couldn't explain.
As they stared at the tree, one of the friends stepped forward and touched its rough bark. Instantly, the whispers stopped and everything became eerily silent. The figure in the shadows began to fade, as if it was disappearing into the darkness. A strange feeling filled the air, and the friends felt a chill run down their spines. They looked around, but nothing seemed the same. The forest had changed, and it was as if they had entered a different world. The tree suddenly creaked, and a hidden door appeared in its trunk. It was small, just big enough for one person to crawl through. Without thinking, the bravest of the group decided to enter. The others hesitated, but curiosity took over. They followed him through the dark doorway into a hidden underground space. The walls were lined with old markings, and the air smelled damp and ancient. Something felt wrong, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The underground space was filled with strange symbols and faded drawings on the walls. The group walked carefully, each step echoing in the silence. As they moved deeper, they reached a large stone altar in the center. On it was an old book, covered in dust and cobwebs. One of the friends reached out to touch it, but just as their fingers brushed the cover, a loud whisper filled the room. It sounded like a warning. "Leave now," the whisper said, louder than ever before. The friends turned, but they couldn't find the source. It was as if the voices were coming from the walls themselves. Fear took hold of them, and they ran back toward the entrance. As they emerged from the dark space, the forest was still, and the figure was gone. The whispers faded, but the memory of what they had seen would haunt them forever.
The group of friends, still shaken by what they had witnessed in the underground space, quickly made their way out of the forest. As they walked, the path seemed to stretch longer than it ever had before. The trees no longer looked familiar, and the whispers had faded, but the feeling of being watched never left them. They hurried, eager to return to the safety of their village, but the silence of the forest felt unnerving. Every step they took was louder than usual, almost as if the forest itself was waking up. The wind rustled through the leaves, but there were no animal sounds or birds singing. It was as if the forest had gone completely still, except for the whispering shadows that seemed to follow them. The air grew colder, and with each passing moment, the friends felt the weight of the forest pressing in on them.
After what seemed like hours, the group finally reached the edge of the forest. But just as they were about to step into the village, they noticed something strange. The path they had walked on was now completely different. The trees on the edge of the forest were twisted and unfamiliar. They didn't remember seeing these trees before. The entrance to the village was nowhere in sight. Confusion set in. The friends turned back, hoping to retrace their steps, but the path seemed to shift again, leading them deeper into the forest instead. The whispers, though softer, could still be heard. It was as if the forest was playing tricks on them. They realized they were lost, and the thought of returning to the dark underground space filled them with dread. Their only choice was to continue walking, hoping they would find the way out. Just as the group was about to give up, they stumbled into another clearing. This one was unlike any they had seen before. The moonlight shone brightly through the trees, illuminating a peaceful, almost magical space. A small pond lay in the center, and the air felt warm, despite the chill of the night. For a moment they felt a sense of calm, but it didn't last long. In the center of the pond, they saw something strange, a glowing stone, resting just beneath the surface. It seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. The friends felt drawn to it, unable to resist the urge to approach. As they stepped closer, the whispers returned, this time louder and more urgent. The voice seemed to speak directly to them, warning them not to touch the stone. But it was too late.
As soon as one of the friends reached into the pond and touched the glowing stone, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The peaceful clearing quickly turned into a place of terror. The trees around them shook violently, and the moonlight was swallowed by dark clouds. The whispering voices grew louder, echoing in their ears. They felt as though the entire forest was alive, angry that they had disturbed its peace. The stone in the pond began to glow brighter, and the shadowy figure they had seen earlier appeared again. But this time, it was much closer. The figure's face was obscured, but the air around it crackled with energy. It spoke, its voice deep and otherworldly. "You have awakened the forest, Now you must face the consequences. The friends froze in fear, realizing they had made a terrible mistake.
The friends stood motionless, unable to speak or move. The whispering voices swirled around them, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadowy figure stepped forward, and for a moment, they could see its eyes. They were empty, dark, and filled with a sadness that sent chills through their bones. The figure extended its hand, offering them a choice. "You can leave, but the forest will never forget you," it said in a whisper. "Or you can stay, and the whispers will guide you forever." The friends knew they had to make a decision, but the fear of what would happen next weighed heavily on their hearts. With no other choice, they turned away from the glowing stone and the figure, running as fast as they could. The whispers followed them, but this time, they didn't turn back. They had learned the forest's secret, but the consequences would stay with them forever. The friends ran without stopping, the eerie whispers fading as they moved further from the haunted clearing. Their hearts pounded in their chests, and their legs felt like they would give way beneath them. When they finally emerged from the forest, the village was in sight. The comforting lights of their homes glowed in the distance. They didn't look back, too afraid to glance at the dark woods behind them. As they reached the village, they were greeted by concerned villagers who had heard their frightened cries. The friends tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed them. The villagers told them it was just their imagination, that the forest had played tricks on them. But the friends knew the truth. They would never be the same after what they had experienced. The whispers still echoed in their minds, and they couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching them. Days passed, but the friends couldn't forget the horrors of the forest. They went back to their daily lives, pretending that nothing had changed. But deep down, they knew something was wrong. Late at night, one of them would hear a faint whisper coming from the shadows, always calling their name. It was the same voice they had heard in the forest, growing closer each time. The whispers followed them everywhere, like a shadow that could never be shaken off. Every corner of their home felt darker, colder. They no longer felt safe, not even in the comfort of their own village. It seemed as though the forest had followed them, unwilling to let them escape. And worse still, they began to see glimpses of the shadowy figure, always watching from afar. One evening, while sitting together in the village square, the friends met an old woman who had heard their story. She seemed to know more than she should and warned them of a terrible truth. "The forest is not just a place," she said in a low, raspy voice. "It's a curse, bound to the land itself. Once it has touched you, it will never let you go. The whispers are its way of calling you back." The friends listened in horror as the old woman explained that they had awakened something ancient in the forest, something that had been lying dormant for centuries. The glowing stone in the pond was the key, a powerful object that could bind a soul to the forest forever. "You must return," she said. "Only then can you break the curse." The friends were terrified. They had hoped the horrors were over, but it seemed like the forest would never release them.
The decision to return to the forest was a painful one, but the friends knew there was no other choice. They packed what little they could carry and set off once more into the darkness. The forest greeted them with the same cold silence they had encountered before. The trees whispered as they walked, and the air grew thick with tension. It felt as though the forest was waiting for them, ready to consume them once more. As they entered the clearing with the glowing stone, everything seemed just as it had been before. The air was thick, the ground trembled slightly, and the shadowy figure appeared once again, standing at the edge of the pond. This time, there was no fear in its eyes, just a deep sadness. The friends knew they had to face it, or they would be trapped forever in the forest's dark grip.
The shadowy figure stepped forward, its cloak billowing in the wind. "You have returned," it said, its voice a mournful whisper. "Now you must make the ultimate choice. Do you wish to be freed from the forest's curse, or will you become a part of it forever?" The friends stood still, unsure of what to do. They knew they couldn't stay, but they feared what might happen if they chose the wrong path. One by one, they stepped forward, placing their hands on the glowing stone. The figure's eyes glowed with an ancient power, but instead of feeling fear, the friends felt a strange calm. The whispers grew silent, and the trees around them seemed to bow down. In that moment, they understood. They had broken the curse. The figure smiled faintly before fading into the shadows. As they left the forest, they felt free, the whispers no longer haunting their thoughts. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, leaving the forest's curse behind forever. After their harrowing journey through the forest, the friends returned to their village with a sense of relief. The whispers had finally stopped, and the darkness that had once followed them seemed to vanish into the night. They were free, or so they thought. But something had changed within them. They no longer felt the same sense of safety in their homes or their village. The memories of the forest lingered, and the bond they shared was stronger than ever. It was as if the forest had left its mark on them, and it would never truly leave. They tried to continue their lives as normal, but the silence of the village now felt unnatural. The wind didn't rustle the trees in the same way, and the stars no longer seemed as bright. The forest had given them something they couldn't explain, an understanding of its power, and a knowledge of the darkness that lay just beyond the edge of their world. One evening, as the friends sat together near the village, they saw something strange. A shadow moved through the trees at the forest's edge, just outside the light of the village lamps. At first, they thought it was just their imagination, but the shadow seemed to grow larger, more distinct. It was no longer just a trick of the light. It was something real, something that was watching them.
The friends stood frozen, unable to look away. The shadow seemed to stretch and twist, as if it was calling them back to the forest. They could hear faint whispers again, though they were much softer this time. The friends knew the forest's curse wasn't truly broken. It was only waiting for the right moment to return. And that moment was fast approaching. The following night, the whispers grew louder. This time, they filled the entire village, echoing in every corner of their homes. It wasn't just the friends who heard them. The entire village seemed to be affected. People woke up in the middle of the night, confused and frightened, hearing the same eerie voices calling from the forest. No one knew what to do. The friends tried to ignore it, but they couldn't. It was as if the forest was reaching out to claim what it had once lost. The villagers gathered together, trying to find answers, but the friends knew they had to face the truth. The curse had never truly been broken. The forest would never let them go until they confronted it once more. The whispers were a warning. There was unfinished business, and it was time to return to the haunted forest, once again.
With heavy hearts, the friends made their way back to the forest. The journey felt more difficult this time, as if the very land was resisting their return. The trees seemed to loom taller and darker, their twisted branches reaching out to block their path. The air grew colder with each step they took. They could hear the whispers growing louder, almost like a chorus of voices guiding them toward the clearing where it all began. As they entered the clearing, the stone in the pond glowed once again. It pulsed with a strange, powerful light. The shadowy figure appeared before them, its eyes glowing with an intensity they had never seen before. This time, it didn't speak right away. Instead, it watched them, as if waiting for something. The friends knew that this final encounter would be the one that decided their fate. The shadowy figure stepped forward, its presence overwhelming. "You have returned, but you are not the same," it whispered, its voice like a low growl. "The forest has changed you. It has taken something from you, and now it demands its price." The friends looked at each other, realizing that the forest had taken more than just their peace. It had taken their sense of safety, their connection to the world they once knew. The figure offered them one last choice. "You can leave now, but you will never be free. Or you can stay and become one with the forest, bound to it forever." The friends felt the weight of the decision press upon them. They knew that staying meant giving up everything they had ever known. But leaving would mean living in fear, knowing that the whispers would never stop. They made their choice, stepping forward to face the darkness one last time, ready to end the curse, no matter the cost. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its presence filling the clearing with a suffocating weight. "You have chosen," it whispered, its voice echoing in the trees. The friends knew they had made their decision, but they weren't sure of what it would cost them. They felt a strange pull toward the glowing stone, as if it was drawing them in. The air around them grew heavier, charged with an energy they couldn't understand. As they reached for the stone, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The shadowy figure's form flickered, as if it was fading in and out of existence. "The forest demands its payment," it hissed, and the ground cracked open, revealing a dark abyss beneath them. As they stumbled through the mist, they saw figures moving in the distance, shapes that seemed both familiar and terrifying. The figures approached them, and the friends realized they were not alone. The forest had claimed others before them, shadows of lost souls, those who had wandered too far into the woods and never returned. Their eyes were hollow, their faces frozen in expressions of fear. The lost souls circled around the friends, their whispers growing louder, as if urging them to stay. "You cannot leave," one of the souls murmured. "The forest claims you now." The friends felt their hearts racing, their breath quickening. The forest was trying to keep them, just as it had kept the others. But they refused to give in. They had to find a way to escape, or they would become part of this place forever. In the distance, the friends saw the glowing stone again, its light beckoning them forward. It was the only thing in this world that seemed real, the only thing that could lead them out of the abyss. With renewed determination, they made their way toward it. But as they got closer, they felt the energy around them grow stronger, pulling them toward the stone with an overwhelming force.
They knew that this was the key to their freedom, but they also knew that using it would come at a price. The shadowy figure appeared once again, standing before the stone. "You cannot escape without facing the consequences," it warned. "The stone will free you, but you will leave a part of yourselves behind." The friends looked at each other, knowing that they had no choice. They had to break the curse, even if it meant sacrificing something precious. Together they reached for the stone, and the moment their hands touched it, the entire world around them began to shake. The moment they touched the stone, the world seemed to collapse around them. The ground cracked open, the sky darkened, and the whispers grew into a deafening roar. The shadowy figure loomed over them, its eyes filled with sorrow. "This is your final choice," it said, its voice echoing in their minds. "You can leave, but you will never be whole again. The forest will take what it wants, and you will never forget what you have lost." The friends stood together, knowing that this was the moment that would determine everything. They had already lost so much: peace, safety, and their sense of reality. But they couldn't let the forest take everything. With one final look at each other, they made their choice. They would leave, but they would carry the scars of the forest with them, forever. As the stone's power enveloped them, they felt their bodies being pulled away from the abyss. The last thing they saw before everything went black was the shadowy figure watching them, fading into the darkness of the forest. When the friends awoke, they found themselves back at the edge of the forest, the village just beyond. The world around them felt different, colder, as though the warmth of reality had faded. They looked at each other, their bodies aching, their minds heavy with the memories of what they had just endured. The whispers, the shadowy figures, and the dark abyss. They were all gone, but the feeling of unease lingered. They tried to convince themselves that the nightmare was over, that they had escaped the forest's curse. But something was missing inside them, a part of their souls that had been taken by the forest. They knew they would never be the same. As they walked back toward the village, the wind carried the faintest whisper, and for a moment, they wondered if they had truly left the forest behind, or if it had followed them, waiting for its next chance. Firul, standing on the bank of the river, scowled at them. Something was missing.
Days passed, and life in the village returned to its usual rhythm. Yet, there was an unsettling silence. The friends had tried to resume their lives, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They felt an unexplainable pull toward the forest, as if it was calling them back. The villagers noticed their strange behavior, but the friends didn't dare speak of what they had experienced. They knew that no one would believe them, not after everything that had happened. Late one evening, as the friends sat together, they heard a faint rustling outside their home. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, closer. It was as if something was moving toward them, something not quite human. Their hearts raced as the door creaked open, but no one was there. The forest's presence was still with them, watching, waiting. They realized then that the forest was not done with them yet. It had left them a reminder, a promise that it would return when the time was right. One night, unable to resist the growing pull, the friends ventured back toward the forest. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the trees. As they stepped deeper into the woods, they felt the air grow thick, heavy with the same strange energy they had encountered before. The trees whispered, their branches creaking like old bones, and the shadows moved around them, as if they were alive. They reached the clearing once again, where the stone had glowed with such power. But this time there was no stone. There was only the darkness, stretching endlessly before them. The shadowy figure appeared, more solid than ever. It spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You cannot escape," it said. "The forest will never let you go. It will always find a way back into your hearts, into your minds. You are its children now." The friends realized that they had been marked, and no matter where they went, the forest would always call them back. The friends stood together in the clearing, facing the figure that had haunted them since the moment they first entered the forest. They were no longer afraid, for they knew that this was the end, the moment they would either break free or be consumed by the darkness forever. The figure stepped forward, its form flickering like a shadow in the moonlight. "This is your last chance," the figure whispered, its voice low and cold. "Leave now, and the forest will claim someone else. Stay, and you will belong to it for eternity." The friends exchanged looks, their decision already made. They would not let the forest take another soul, not after everything they had already sacrificed. With one final step, they walked toward the shadow, ready to face whatever fate awaited them. As they approached the shadow, something extraordinary happened. The ground trembled beneath them, and the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. The figure disappeared, its form dissipating into the wind. The whispers fell silent, leaving an eerie stillness behind. For a moment, the friends thought they had finally broken the curse, that they had won. But as they turned to leave, they saw a shadow, faint but unmistakable, watching them from the edge of the clearing. It was the same figure, its eyes glowing with a haunting intensity. The friends realized that the forest was not something they could escape. It was part of them now, a part that would never fade. They had survived, yes, but at what cost? The forest had claimed a piece of their souls, and they would carry that darkness with them, wherever they went. As they left the forest behind, they knew that the whispers would never truly stop. They would hear them again, perhaps in the quiet of the night, perhaps in the rustling of the leaves. And when they did, they would remember that the forest was always watching, always waiting for the next moment it could call them back. As weeks turned into months, the friends tried to live their lives as best they could, but the memories of the forest never left them. Every time the wind howled through the trees, they felt that same eerie presence. They had hoped that time would heal them, that the whispers would fade, but they were wrong. The forest had left its mark on them, and it would never truly let them go. One night, as they gathered in their homes, they heard the familiar rustling outside again. At first, they thought it was just their imagination, but then the whispers began low and soft, like a song carried by the wind. The friends froze, their hearts pounding. They could feel the forest calling them, beckoning them to return. The darkness had found its way into their hearts, and they knew that they couldn't escape it, no matter how far they ran. Unable to ignore the pull any longer, the friends returned to the forest, their minds clouded with the fear of what they might find. The trees loomed above them like silent sentinels, their twisted branches whispering in the wind. The clearing was just as they remembered it, except this time, it felt colder, darker, as if the forest was waiting for them. The shadowy figure appeared once again, its form more solid than before, its glowing eyes fixed on them. "You have returned," it hissed. "I warned you that the forest would never let you go." Now, it has claimed you, and you will belong to it forever. The friends stood their ground, refusing to back down. They had faced the forest before, and they would do it again. But deep inside, they knew this would be their final confrontation. The figure's presence grew heavier, the air thick with the weight of its power. The friends could feel the darkness pressing in on them, threatening to consume them once more. The whispers grew louder, echoing in their minds. "You must give up something to be free," the figure intoned. "What will you sacrifice? Your memories? Your hopes? Your very souls?" The friends exchanged a look, knowing what they had to do. They could not live with the fear of the forest hanging over them forever. They had to let go, to free themselves from the curse. Slowly, one by one, they stepped forward, offering the forest the one thing it had demanded, something precious. They each gave up a piece of themselves, something they could never get back, hoping it would be enough to break the bond between them and the forest. As the friends made their sacrifices, the figure seemed to grow weaker, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. The darkness that had surrounded them began to lift, and for the first time since entering the forest, they felt a sense of peace. The forest, once a place of terror and whispers, seemed to fade into the distance. The shadows receded, and the whispers grew quiet, as if the forest had finally accepted their offering. But even as the friends turned to leave, they felt a deep, aching emptiness inside them. The price they had paid was not one they could ever recover from. The memories of the forest, the horrors they had faced, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had escaped, yes, but at what cost? The forest had taken more than just their peace, it had taken something far more valuable. And as they walked away, they knew that they would never truly be free of its grasp. Years passed, and the friends lived out their lives in the village, but the shadows of the forest never fully faded from their hearts. No matter where they went, they could feel the forest's presence lurking in the corners of their minds. The whispers had stopped, but the memories lingered, like a scar that would never heal. One evening, as the sun set and the wind began to stir, the friends sat together, reflecting on their experiences. They realized that no matter how far they ran, they would never truly escape the forest. It had changed them, shaped them in ways they couldn't fully understand. The forest was not just a place, it was a part of them, and it always would be. As they looked out at the horizon, they knew that the shadows would always be with them, following them wherever they went. The whispers may have faded, but the forest's darkness would remain, a reminder of the price they had paid and the things they had lost. Years after their escape from the haunted forest, the friends continued their lives, trying to forget the horrors they had faced. But they couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching them, waiting for the moment when they would be weak enough to return. The quiet whispers would sometimes drift through their dreams, waking them in the dead of night with an unsettling sense of dread. They had tried to move on, but the shadow of the forest never let go. One evening, as they sat around the fire, one of the friends, now much older, spoke up. "Do you ever feel like it's still out there? That it's still calling us?" The others looked at him with silent understanding. They had all felt it, the pull, the darkness, the whispers. They knew they couldn't ignore it much longer. The forest wasn't done with them. It was waiting, and it would come for them again when the time was right. The night was still when they decided to go back. Each of them carried the weight of their past, the memories of the horrors they had faced, and the knowledge that they had never truly escaped. The forest stood in the distance, its dark silhouette against the night sky. As they approached, the air seemed to grow colder, the ground beneath their feet feeling strangely alive, as if the forest itself was welcoming them home. The whispers began as they crossed the threshold of the trees. Low, soft, and haunting, the voices of the forest reached out to them, pulling them deeper into the darkness. This time, there was no fear in their hearts. They knew that this was inevitable, that the forest would always find a way to claim them. They walked forward, determined to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that their journey through the haunted woods was far from over. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, wrapping around them like a suffocating fog. The trees twisted above them, their branches reaching out like hands, pulling them toward the center of the forest. The whispers became louder, more insistent, until it felt as though the voices were inside their heads, echoing in their minds. They tried to ignore the growing unease, but it was impossible. The forest was claiming them again, pulling them into its heart, where the darkness was strongest. They reached the clearing once more, but this time it was different. The stone that had once been there was gone, replaced by a deep, swirling abyss. It was as if the forest had opened a portal to something far darker. The figure appeared again, its form more menacing than ever. "You have returned," it said, its voice filled with malice. "You cannot escape. You are mine, body and soul. And now, you will pay the final price." The friends stood at the edge of the abyss, the shadowy figure staring them down with glowing eyes. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the darkness seemed to stretch forever. It was then that they realized the true cost of their escape. The forest had not only claimed their peace, but had also infected their very souls. Now, the time had come to make their final choice. "Choose," the figure said, its voice booming. "Sacrifice everything you have ever known and become one with the forest. Or walk away and let the forest claim those you love." The choice is yours. The friends exchanged a look, knowing that whatever they chose, the forest would never release them. But they had to make a choice. With heavy hearts, they made their decision, offering the forest the last piece of themselves. It was a painful sacrifice, but it was the only way to save those they cared for. The forest grew silent, as if waiting for the consequence of their choice. The figure disappeared, its form vanishing into the shadows. The air around them lightened, and the whispers faded into the distance. But the friends knew it wasn't truly over. The forest had taken what it wanted, and they would never be the same. They had sacrificed everything to break free, but in doing so, they had lost a part of themselves that could never be recovered. As they left the forest behind, the weight of their decision heavy on their hearts, they knew that the forest would always be a part of them. The whispers might fade, the shadows might recede, but the echoes of the haunted woods would never truly leave them. They had escaped, but they had also been marked by the forest's curse, and the darkness would follow them for the rest of their lives. The friends returned to their village, but the peace they had longed for never came. Their lives seemed normal at first, but beneath the surface, there was a growing unease. They couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as though unseen chains bound them to the forest. Every time they closed their eyes, they could hear the soft rustle of leaves and the faintest whisper, just beyond their hearing. The forest was still with them, lurking in the shadows of their lives. One night, as they gathered in the familiar warmth of their homes, a cold wind blew through the windows. The door creaked open, though none of them had touched it. It wasn't the wind, it was the forest, reaching out to remind them that it still had a hold on them. The friends looked at one another, fear creeping into their hearts. They knew that this was not the end. The forest had found a way to follow them, and they could not escape it. The whispers grew louder with each passing day. At first it was just a soft voice on the wind, too faint to make out the words. But soon they could hear them clearly, their names, spoken in voices they knew all too well. The voice of the shadowy figure, the whispers of the forest, calling them back. It was as if the forest was trying to lure them into its depths once again. One evening, the friends couldn't ignore it any longer. The wind carried the whispers with such intensity that it felt like they were being pulled toward the woods. Reluctantly, they gathered together and made their way back to the clearing. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of their past mistakes dragging them down. The forest loomed before them, darker and more ominous than ever. They had come back, but they weren't sure if they were ready for what awaited them. As they entered the heart of the forest, the air grew thick with tension. The trees towered over them, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The whispers filled their ears, each one more insistent than the last. The forest had changed since their last visit. The once familiar path was now shrouded in an unnatural darkness. The ground beneath their feet felt soft, like it was sucking them in, as if the forest was trying to swallow them whole. The clearing appeared again, but it was different this time. The stone they had seen before was back, but it was covered in ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The shadowy figure stood in the center, waiting for them. "You have returned," it said, its voice colder than before. "The forest never forgets. And now you must pay for your defiance." The friends stood before the figure, their hearts heavy with dread. They had come so far, only to find themselves trapped once more. The figure's eyes glowed with a malevolent light as it spoke again. "You thought you could escape, but the forest is eternal. It will always find a way to claim what is rightfully its." The friends tried to back away, but the ground beneath them seemed to shift, pulling them closer to the figure. Desperation filled their hearts. They had given up everything before, but this time the cost seemed too high. The figure gave them one final choice: leave now, and the forest will claim those you love. Stay, and become part of the forest forever. The friends stood frozen, torn between the love they felt for each other and the fear of what might happen if they chose wrong. They knew they had no easy choice, no way out, and no more sacrifices to offer. With no other option left, the friends made their final choice. They decided to stay, hoping that somehow the forest would allow them to protect those they loved. But as they did, the air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. The whispers became a loud, overwhelming roar, filling their minds and hearts with fear. They felt their bodies begin to change, their skin turning pale, their eyes growing distant. In that moment, the shadowy figure's voice rang out, echoing through the trees. "You are mine now," it said, "and you will never leave the forest." "Your souls belong to the shadows," the friends screamed, but no sound came. They could feel themselves fading, becoming part of the forest, their bodies consumed by its eternal darkness. And as the whispers died down, the friends vanished, leaving only the faintest traces of their presence behind. The forest grew quiet once again, but the whispering shadows would never fade. For those who had entered the forest, it was their home now, their souls bound to the trees forever. And the wind continued to carry the whispers of the haunted woods, echoing through the ages. Years passed, and the village near the forest continued to grow, but no one spoke of the friends who had ventured into the haunted woods. They were forgotten, their names erased from memory, as though they had never existed. But sometimes, when the wind blew just right, those who lived near the forest would hear the faintest whispers. It was as if the forest itself had memories of those who had been lost to it. One evening, a young girl named Lily wandered too close to the forest's edge. She had heard the stories, of course, but she didn't believe them. It was just an old tale, she thought. But as she stood there, something caught her eye, a strange movement in the trees. And then she heard it, the whispers. At first they were faint, but soon they grew louder, calling her name. The same chilling voices that had once haunted the friends now echoed through the trees, beckoning her closer. Lily stood frozen at the edge of the forest, unable to move. The whispers called to her, pulling her toward the darkness. "Come closer," they whispered. "Come see what we have waiting for you." Her heart raced and her instincts told her to run, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. She had heard the stories, but she had never truly believed them until now. As she stepped closer to the trees, the wind picked up, and the air turned cold. The whispers grew louder, almost as if they were speaking directly to her. "We know you," they said. "You have been chosen. Come and join us in the forest. We are waiting." Lily's breath caught in her throat as she took another step, drawn deeper into the darkness. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers. It was as though the forest was alive, and it was waiting for her to become part of it. The moment Lily crossed into the forest, the temperature dropped dramatically. A cold shiver ran down her spine as the whispers surrounded her, their voices growing louder, more urgent. "Come closer," they repeated. "Join us." As she walked deeper into the forest, she felt as though something was watching her, following her every move. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing there, only darkness. The path she had been following began to twist and change, becoming less like a path and more like a maze. The trees seemed to shift, their bark now twisted and jagged. The whispers grew frantic, urging her to go faster, to find what they were leading her to. The whispers now filled her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. She could feel the forest wrapping itself around her, pulling her into its depths. Every time she tried to move, the shadows held her tighter. There was no escaping now. The figure reached out, its cold fingers brushing against her face. "You will become one with the forest," it said. Just like the others before you, Lily's vision blurred, and her body grew heavy. She could feel herself fading, becoming part of the forest, just as the friends had. Her last thought was of the village she had left behind and the lives she had never gotten to live. And then everything went dark. The whispers continued, echoing through the trees, forever calling to those who wandered too close to the haunted forest. And Lily, like so many before her, became just another shadow in the woods. As time passed, the village near the haunted forest seemed to fall under a heavy, unshakable gloom. People no longer ventured near the woods, afraid of the whispers that haunted the air. But those who lived close could still feel the weight of the forest's wrath. The whispers now filled her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. She could feel the forest wrapping itself around her, pulling her into its depths. Every time she tried to move, the shadows held her tighter. There was no escaping now. The figure reached out, its cold fingers brushing against her face. "You will become one with the forest," it said. Just like the others before you, Lily's vision blurred, and her body grew heavy. She could feel herself fading, becoming part of the forest, just as the friends had. Her last thought was of the village she had left behind and the lives she had never gotten to live. And then everything went dark. The whispers continued, echoing through the trees, forever calling to those who wandered too close to the haunted forest. And Lily, like so many before her, became just another shadow in the woods. As time passed, the village near the haunted forest seemed to fall under a heavy, unshakable gloom. People no longer ventured near the woods, afraid of the whispers that haunted the air. But those who lived close could still feel the weight of the forest's wrath. Strange things began to happen. Cattle disappeared, crops withered overnight, and people reported seeing shadowy figures standing at the edges of the trees, watching them with glowing eyes. No one dared to speak of it openly, but the whispers had returned stronger than ever. Late at night, when the wind howled through the village, some would hear their names carried on the breeze. The forest was alive, and it was angry. The village was in its grip, and no one knew how to break free. The shadowy figure had claimed more souls, and with each one, its power grew. It was clear that no one was safe. One night, a brave woman named Emily, whose brother had disappeared into the forest many years ago, decided she would no longer live in fear. She had heard the whispers herself, calling her brother's name in the wind. Her heart burned with the desire to end the curse that plagued the village. Emily gathered a group of the bravest villagers and set out toward the forest, determined to confront whatever dark force lay within. They made their way to the clearing, where the shadowy figure had once stood. But when they arrived, the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. Not a single sound could be heard, no rustling leaves, no cries of animals. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Emily's heart raced, but she didn't turn back. "We will break this curse," she whispered, stepping into the heart of the forest, her group following closely behind. But the deeper they went, the darker it became, and the whispers grew louder, stronger. As Emily and the villagers ventured further into the forest, the path began to twist and turn in impossible directions. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches reaching out as though trying to touch them. It was no longer a place of nature, it was a place of hunger. Emily could feel the shadows watching her, their eyes invisible but always present. There was something else in the air, a sense of waiting, as though the forest was anticipating their next move. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through, and the whispers stopped. In the silence, Emily could hear her heartbeat in her ears. She looked around, but there was no sign of life, no trace of the forest's usual movements. It was as though everything had been paused, suspended in time. And then, from the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes appeared. They were familiar eyes she had seen many times in her dreams. It was the shadowy figure watching from the trees. The shadowy figure stepped forward, its presence darkening the air even more. Its voice rang out, cold and hollow. "You think you can defeat me?" it asked. "You are just like the others, weak, foolish, and full of hope." The villagers stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. Emily gripped her brother's old jacket, her fingers trembling. She had come here to save him, to save them all, but now she felt more helpless than ever. The forest was too strong. But Emily was not ready to give up. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "We have lived in fear for far too long," she said. "We won't let you take any more lives." The shadowy figure laughed, a sound that sent chills down their spines. "You cannot stop me," it said. "You have already lost." The forest will always claim what it is owed, and with those words, the shadows closed in around them. But Emily's heart still burned with defiance. She refused to give up, no matter the cost. The villagers gathered their courage, standing together against the dark figure. But the shadows surged forward with such force that they were swept off their feet. Emily screamed as the darkness enveloped her, her body feeling as though it was being torn apart by the unseen hands of the forest. The others tried to fight, but it was no use. The forest was too powerful, too ancient. It had consumed them all, one by one, their voices lost in the wind. As Emily felt herself slipping into the darkness, she thought of her brother, lost to the shadows so many years ago. She thought of the village she had hoped to save. But now, she too would become part of the forest, her soul bound to its eternal whispers. The shadows wrapped around her, their cold embrace final and complete. There would be no escape, no freedom. The forest had claimed them all. And as the last of their voices faded, the whispers of the haunted woods carried on, forever echoing through the ages. The village near the haunted forest began to wither. The once thriving homes now stood abandoned, with broken windows and doors left ajar. The people who had once lived there were gone. Their absence felt like a heavy weight on the land. The whispers from the forest could still be heard at night, calling out to the empty village. But now, there were no more villagers to hear them. The curse had claimed not just the forest, but the life of the village itself. Some said the spirits of those who had been lost wandered the streets at night, trapped between the forest and the world they had once known. They would never find peace. The wind howled through the empty homes, carrying with it the faintest echoes of the lost villagers' voices. It was a warning to anyone who dared to listen. The forest was still hungry, and it would never stop. Deep in the heart of the haunted forest, the lost souls of Emily and the others roamed in an endless loop. They could no longer remember their names or the lives they had lived before. All they knew was the darkness that consumed them, the eternal whispers that tugged at their minds. It was as if they had been erased from the world, their memories scattered in the wind. Emily's heart ached as she wandered among the trees. She could still feel her brother's presence, faint but there. His spirit was with her, lost in the same endless night. "We are not forgotten," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the shadows around her only deepened. The forest had taken their essence, leaving them trapped in its dark embrace, never to see the light again. They were the forgotten ones lost to the forest's insatiable hunger. One night, long after the village had vanished, a lone traveler ventured too close to the haunted forest. His name was David, a man seeking adventure in the wilderness. He had heard the old stories of the haunted woods, but like many before him, he did not believe. As he set up camp at the edge of the forest, the wind began to pick up, sending chills through his body. It wasn't long before the whispers began, faint at first but growing louder with every passing minute. David tried to ignore them, thinking it was the wind or his imagination. But the whispers were relentless, calling his name in a strange, melodic tone. His curiosity led him closer to the forest's edge, and as he stepped into the shadows, the air grew colder. The whispers became clearer, more urgent. "You are mine now," they said, their voices weaving together. David stopped dead in his tracks, his heart racing. He realized, far too late, that he had made the same mistake as so many before him. David felt a chill crawl up his spine as he stood frozen, the forest closing in around him. He could see the shadows moving, twisting and shifting like living creatures. A shape began to form among the trees, the same figure that had claimed so many souls before him. Its glowing eyes locked onto his, and for a moment David felt as if time itself had stopped. The shadowy figure stepped forward, its presence overwhelming, and spoke in a low, hypnotic voice. "You've come to the forest, and now you belong to it," it said. "There is no escaping the forest's embrace. No one has ever left once they've crossed this threshold." David's breath caught in his throat. He tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't move. The whispers rose to a crescendo, drowning out his thoughts. The figure reached out with long, bony fingers, its touch sending waves of cold through his body. It was too late to escape. The forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others. David's body began to change as the shadows wrapped around him. His skin turned pale, his eyes became distant, and his breath grew shallow. It was as if his very essence was being consumed by the forest. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The whispers filled his mind, their words weaving together in an incomprehensible chorus. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went dark. David was lost to the forest. His soul became just another shadow, wandering the endless expanse of trees. The whispers continued, ever present, calling to those who would listen. And so the forest remained, its hunger never satisfied, its shadows always watching. The village had long since disappeared, but the curse endured, an eternal reminder of the power of the haunted woods. The shadows would never fade. The whispers would never stop, and the forest would continue to claim those who dared to venture too close, binding them to the darkness forever. Years passed, and the forest grew even darker, its power ever more insistent. A faint trail had once led to the heart of the haunted woods, but now it was hidden beneath thick vines and twisted roots. The villagers who once lived near the forest had long since forgotten its secrets, but the shadows still called out to those who would listen. The forest, though silent to the outside world, was far from empty. It waited patiently, its hunger insatiable. One evening, a group of curious travelers arrived at the outskirts of the abandoned village. They had heard the rumored stories of a haunted forest and lost souls, and they were determined to uncover the truth. But the moment they stepped foot into the land that bordered the forest, a strange sensation took hold of them. The air felt thick, as if the forest itself was watching. They had unknowingly crossed the boundary, and the whispers began to creep into their minds. The group of travelers walked deeper into the forest, each step feeling heavier than the last. As they ventured further, the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching toward the sky. A cold breeze swept through, carrying with it a voice, a whisper so faint they could barely make it out. "Leave this place," it said, its tone like the rustling of dry leaves. One of the travelers, a man named Jason, paused and looked around, his heart racing. "Did you hear that?" he asked, but the others dismissed him. "It's just the wind," one of them said, but Jason wasn't so sure. The whisper had felt too real, too personal. As they continued on, the air grew colder and the voices grew louder, more urgent. They couldn't see who was speaking, but the whispers seemed to surround them, pressing in from all sides. The travelers' nerves began to fray as the forest grew denser. The path they followed became less clear, and the shadows seemed to move around them. They tried to keep their bearings, but no matter which way they turned, the forest seemed to shift, as though it was playing with them. The further they walked, the more they felt a strange presence. It wasn't just the whispers; they could feel eyes on them. watching from the darkness. One of the travelers, Sarah, began to panic. "We're being followed," she whispered, her voice trembling. The others shook their heads, dismissing her fears, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted by something unseen. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them shifted, and the path they had been following disappeared. The travelers were now lost, surrounded by the ever-encroaching shadows. In the heart of the forest, the travelers finally stopped. The shadows were closing in, and the air was thick with dread. The whispers grew louder until they were no longer faint, but clear and distinct. They could hear voices calling out from the trees, but there was no one to be seen. "Help us," the voices cried. "Find the way out." It was then that the travelers realized that the whispers were not just a warning, they were the voices of the lost souls, the ones who had vanished into the forest before them. They had been trapped, just like the villagers, and now they too were calling out for help. But there was no escape. The forest had claimed them, and it would claim the travelers as well. As the voices swirled around them, the air grew heavier and the shadows grew darker. The travelers understood too late that they had become part of the forest, trapped forever in the whisper's embrace. As the last of the travelers vanished into the shadows, the forest stood still once more. The whispers faded, but the darkness remained, swallowing everything in its path. The forest was alive, but not in the way the living would understand. It was a place of hunger, a place where time had no meaning. The souls of the lost were bound to its trees, wandering endlessly, their voices a haunting reminder of what awaited those who dared to enter. The village was long gone, and the path to the forest's heart had vanished with it. Yet, the forest's hunger continued, always seeking the next soul to claim. The shadows would never fade, the whispers would never stop, and the eternal darkness would never be lifted. For as long as the forest stood, there would always be those who heard the call and those who would join the lost souls, forever trapped in the grasp of the whispering shadows. Years passed, but the legend of the haunted forest persisted, whispered from generation to generation. Though no one dared to enter, there were still those who believed in the possibility of salvation. Stories began to spread of a flicker of hope, a light that could guide lost souls out of the forest's clutches. It was said to appear once every 100 years, a beacon that shone through the thick darkness of the trees. But no one could say for sure if it was real or just another tale told by the brave or foolish. One night, a young woman named Lily, determined to find her missing brother who had disappeared years ago, made the fateful decision to venture into the forest. She had heard the rumors of the light and refused to believe that her brother was lost forever. Armed with nothing but her courage and the hope that the stories were true, she crossed the boundary into the haunted woods. As she walked deeper into the forest, she felt an unease settle over her. The trees seemed to close in on her, and the whispers began again. As Lily ventured further into the forest, the darkness seemed to press against her from all sides. The trees, ancient and twisted, formed a canopy that blocked out the moonlight, leaving her in an eerie, unnatural darkness. She could feel the weight of the forest around her, suffocating and oppressive. Yet, she pushed forward, hoping that the light she had heard of would appear. Hours passed, and just when Lily thought she couldn't go on, she noticed something faint, just a flicker coming from deeper within the trees. Her heart skipped a beat. It was the light, glowing softly in the distance. Lily quickened her pace, driven by a mix of fear and hope. The whispers grew louder, but she didn't stop. The light was her only chance, and she had to reach it before the forest consumed her like it had consumed so many before. As Lily neared the light, the forest seemed to shift around her. The path she had been following began to disappear, and the shadows seemed to grow thicker, darker, and more tangible. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices pleading for her to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But Lily didn't listen. Her focus was solely on the light ahead. The closer she got, the more she could hear the sounds of movement in the forest. It wasn't just the wind anymore, it was as if something was following her, moving with her through the trees. Lily's breath became shallow as she glanced over her shoulder, but all she saw was the darkness closing in. She was no longer sure if the light was real or if it was just another trick of the forest, a false hope to lure her deeper into its grasp. Finally, Lily reached the clearing where the light shone brightly, cutting through the thick shadows. She could hardly believe her eyes. There, in the center of the clearing, stood a tall figure, an ethereal being, glowing with a soft, warm light. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, both human and otherworldly. It spoke in a gentle, soothing voice. "You have found it," it said. "But you are not alone." Lily stood frozen, unable to speak, as the figure reached out its hand. The whispers that had surrounded her for so long fell silent, replaced by a deep, heavy stillness. It was as though time itself had stopped. The figure's eyes were full of sadness, as if it understood the suffering Lily had endured. "You seek your brother," the figure said, "but the forest has claimed him. It claims all who enter." The words chilled Lily's bones, but she didn't turn away. She needed to know if there was any chance to save her brother. The figure's glow grew brighter, almost blinding, as it continued to speak. "You have come far, and you may leave with your brother's soul if you choose. But know this: to take him from the forest, you must leave something of equal value in his place." The words echoed in Lily's mind. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Could she bear to leave something behind in exchange for her brother's freedom? Lily hesitated, her heart torn. She had come so far, but the price was steep. The forest had already taken so much from her, and now it asked for more. Her brother's soul was within reach, but so was the chance for her own survival. The whispers began again, this time softer, more coaxing. She looked into the figure's eyes, seeing the sorrow within. She knew what the forest wanted. It wanted her to choose. And as the light flickered once more, Lily realized that her journey was far from over. As the whispers faded into the distance and the light of the haunted forest dimmed, Lily stood at the edge of the clearing, torn between the past and the future. The shadows would always remain, watching, waiting, but for now the forest's eerie whispers fell silent, allowing her a moment of peace. Though the path ahead remained uncertain, Lily knew that her journey, one of hope, loss, and the search for answers, was far from over. With each step she took away from the forest, the weight of the forest's call seemed to lessen, but she could still feel its presence lingering, like a forgotten memory. It would always be a part of her, as it had been a part of all those who ventured too far into its heart. And as Lily walked toward the light of a new day, she knew that the forest's secrets would never truly be forgotten. The whispering shadows of the haunted forest would remain, always waiting for the next soul to dare to listen.